Thank you both so much for being here tonight. I think there are many in the audience who probably have many questions of both of you. So I think the structure of the evening will be that we will have our conversation, and then we'll open it up to our audience for additional questions. And we have some images from Flora that are in the background looping. And I don't believe we're going to talk about any specific one, but it is great to have that as a resource should we need to. So again, I want to thank you guys for being here tonight. I first encountered Flora 2.5 years ago when I was in Venice. It was the first pavilion that I was with a group of patrons from Denver. It was the first pavilion that we walked into, and we were all just not just kind of enamored and enwrapped by the work, but because it had this connection to Denver, we felt like, how did this all come together? And I think one of the things I hope that we can speak about tonight is, in fact, the journey of this exhibition and this project, because it has lived for a number of years now, and I think it's a wonderful story to be able to share just your journey with it, and then, of course, how the work has lived in the world. So I actually, I wanted to start by asking a little bit about their background and their practice, but I think I'm just going to skirt over that for the moment and get into the story of Flora. Of course, Flora Mayo's story begins in Denver. It journeys to Paris and then to Los Angeles, but in a sense, it really launches in Venice. Can you share with us how this project began, how it developed, and how it has grown?
First, before we go there, I just want to say it's an honor for us to show at the MCA Denver. We're very grateful to you and your team. It was really important for us with the project that, if possible, we could show in cities where Flora Mayo had lived, and it was great to be able to bring this to Denver. So thank you. The journey of Flora. When Philip Kaiser first approached us about showing in the Swiss Pavilion, we talked a lot about the history of the site, the history of the Swiss Pavilion per se, and we bounced a lot of ideas around, and Philip's known our work for a long time, and he knows that it's research-based, and after several rounds of conversations, he came back and said, one of the interesting things about the Swiss Pavilion is that one of the arguably the most famous artists in the 20th century, Alberto Giacometti, never showed at the Swiss Pavilion, and he thought that absence was interesting, and so he asked us to think about absence in whatever direction that would take us, and he gave us carte blanche, and to his credit, he trusted us. We started from the standpoint of, for me, as you heard, I grew up in Australia, and most of my art history was very male-dominated. I saw a lot of slides. I didn't have a chance to experience a lot of work of art that I was being taught in person. And so, of course, I knew about Alberto Giacometti, but I'd never really had the opportunity to experience his work personally in person until later on in my life. So for me, I felt as though I needed to enter this idea of absence by reading more about him. Jump to reading maybe 20 or 30 books. There are hundreds of books, hundreds. At the university where we teach, which is the University of Texas at Austin, there are hundreds of books about him. So we tackled going through all of that literature, and we came across biography about Giacometti by James Lord. And in that book, there's a photograph, very small, very poor quality, of Alberto Giacometti as a handsome young man sitting next to a woman. And it was the description of the photograph that really triggered an entire sort of set of doors opening. So, and it's so sexist, it's so misogynistic, it's so wrong that it's kind of seared in my memory. And about this small blurry photograph, James Lord writes, "Flora looks at her lover wistfully, as she had cause to do. She is attractive, but not beautiful, and there is something weak in her face. It must have been apparent even then that she was one of those destined to be destroyed by circumstances."
This is perfect timing. There's the photograph. Oh.
So that started the journey.
Yeah, maybe I should just fill in about Alberto Giacometti. It's not, we don't want to assume that everybody would know him. So Alberto Giacometti is actually a Swiss artist, and most people do not know that. They assume he's French because he spent his summers in Switzerland and pretty much the rest of the year in Paris, which at the time was the center of contemporary art world. So we talk about 1925. That's him. He was very photogenic. He knew where he was coming from a family of artists. His father was well known. So it was clear from very, very young age that he would become an artist himself. He was very talented, very gifted. And so he eventually goes and studies with Antoine Bourdelle in Paris in 1920. So the story, to go back to the story about the Swiss Pavilion, so he has kindly refused several times when he received an invitation by the Swiss Arts Council, the commission that chooses the artist to represent the Swiss in the Swiss Biennial, in the Venice Biennial, and in the Swiss Pavilion, in the Venice Biennial. And so that's sort of the background. And
wait, why did he refuse?
Why did he refuse? So he refused because he was very strategic. He wanted to be seen amongst his peers, which would show in the French pavilion. Mm-hmm. And so for the people who have never been at the Venice Biennial, these pavilions are all located in one place in Venice. Venice Biennial is the oldest art biennial in the world. It was founded in 1895, so it's the longest currently running biennial for contemporary art. So he wanted to be seen amongst his peers, and so the Swiss pavilion and the French pavilion, they're about 400 meters apart. So you can stroll in a minute over to the other pavilion. But it was all about the prestige. And eventually he does show in the French pavilion twice, and eventually he will receive an award of the Venice Biennial for painting, but not for sculpture, but not for painting.
Yeah. And so I'd say like this invitation to think about absence, very quickly Giacometti became a portal in which we could pass through like a back door onto other kinds of absence. You know, when we also looked at the history of the Swiss Pavilion, how few women have ever shown there. And so we sort of took this proposal of absence and took it to another place.
The journey, given that you kind of started in one place, and as you said, you know, Philip, the curator, had a lot of trust in you that you were going to arrive at, you know, an incredible project, which obviously you did. But there's so much like there's such a leap of faith in that you didn't. I don't know that you ever know kind of where you're going to land when you begin or commence a project, but in this instance, it feels like you were really there was so much openness to how the journey would evolve. Did you guys ever, like, were there ever moments where you thought, oh God, this is the wrong path, or oh no, you know, did you ever have that kind of doubt that we mere humans sometimes experience.
Yeah, I mean, there was one moment. I mean, there were many, many moments. There's a lot of doubts. As an artist, you always doubt, I think. We had hardly any time to think
Can you
about
explain
the failure.
a
but
little bit of
there was really this one moment.
Yeah.
So we started researching. I read this biography when I was an art student in Switzerland. I overread this whole section. So when I reread this biography, then I read again about this American in Denver. And since I have been living now in the United States for 20 years in Texas, suddenly Denver became a place, and I really got curious who could this person be, who was this woman from Denver who had this relationship, who was in Paris, and so suddenly it really drew my attention, and also the way she was written about. So it's interesting, a lot of people have read this book. It was a bestseller. It's still one of the most read biographies about Alberto Giacometti, and even a lot of art historians say that they actually missed that small entry within this large book. So there was this one, so we basically read all the biographies that we could get, like we got stacks, it was in the summer 2016, we got stacks of books, tried to read everything we could on Alberto Giacometti, and there was this one moment where we already knew we want to make a work about Flora Mayo, this woman, but we had no idea who she was, what is her background, where can we find more information. And then there was this one moment we came across a book that was published.
Well, I think one of the
Yes.
things, sorry, just to interject, is it was also interesting to see how often the sort of authority of art history or an art historian is just rubber stamped. We would see the same misinformation about Flora Mayo again and again. That she was this artist, vaguely had some talent, and she disappears. And it was interesting, we sort of followed that rubber stamping until we came to a moment where we thought, holy shit. But then, holy shit. It was the director of the Giacometti Foundation, a very esteemed art historian, an expert in Giacometti. Her name is Veronique Wiesinger. Began to publish around 2004, 2005 that the woman in the photograph was not Flora Mayo, and that she was another artist altogether. And so we had those two reactions, because on the one hand we thought we're following the wrong person. For all these months we've been following the wrong person, and the person is not who we think it is. We think it is. And so it went from pretty high on the ladder of fear to pretty high on the level of wow, like this is thrilling. And that was the thrill of.
That was the thrill.
That's what we look for in the work. We look for those moments of complete not knowing, and things can work out, and things sometimes work out in a way you'd never perceive. And so then what that meant for us is then, and we have mutual friends that sort of helped us in that moment, because here we were getting ready to kind of unpack the research of a powerful, esteemed art historian, and to ask her to lead us through her research about how she came to that conclusion in a way that led to finding out that she had made a pretty she had jumped to conclusions. So then what that meant for us is that Flora Mayo, as whoever she was, she gets written into art history only to be dissed. And then she gets written out starting in 2005 because she's not, Flora Mayo's not Flora Mayo. And it also meant that the object made by the woman in the photograph, then even not that artwork is made by her either. And so that really compelled us to, we knew that if we were going to find this woman called Flora Mayo, we had to find her family. And that,
well, we had to prove, we
to
followed
find
all
other
the research
photographs.
of Veronique Wiesinger, who at the time was the director of the Giacometti Foundation, which has the largest holdings of Giacometti work. So we had to basically find proof. And the only way how we would find proof is finding another photograph. At the time, this was the only existing photograph of this woman that supposedly is Flora Mayo, but then was supposedly not Flora Mayo. So we had to find other photographs. And by this era, this era forced us to find something about this woman's family. Nobody ever asked the question, well, what happened to Flora Mayo after she left in 1933 Paris and went back to the United States? And we basically researched as much as we could, and we came across this incredible, I mean, it was just, unbelievable that we found her son that nobody knew existed, who still was alive. And
well, I think Veronique Wiesinger's era and us realizing, wait a second, that just doesn't, and to her credit, she was corresponding with us, but we could just tell from her.
She was open to your research. She wasn't standoffish or resistant. Or was she?
I think she was open to our interest following her research.
Yeah.
Because
it was simultaneous. Can one be simultaneously open and closed?
Yeah.
Or open and defensive at the same time? But it was also, she was very kind. I mean, she didn't have to engage with us at all, and she did, and we're grateful for her era because it forced us to ask different kinds of questions. You know, it really put us in a corner that really forced us to re-examine what that corner,
and
was.
That's part of how when you set about the project, you just didn't know really what the final destination was going to be. And this is one of those kinds of inflection points, or maybe even naters, where you were thinking, oh gosh, how are we going to move this forward? And then it forced you to, as you said, ask different questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, without that era, we never would have found David, and David never would have had the chance to speak about his mother. I mean, it would have stayed in this garage, and these photographs would have passed into a
who knows,
Salvation Army.
Yeah. Well, that raises a good point, which is the way that the film is structured, and certainly in a sense the exhibition as a whole, is it's very conversational. You have all these different back and forth between different different figures, whether that's David and his mother, or it's Flora and Alberto, or, kind of more abstractly, the past and the present, these two different, pre-war Paris and, contemporary suburban Southern California. They're both contrasts, and yet also there's continuity. Can you talk about that as a kind of structural device? And I don't mean that in the filmic aspect. I know that's like dangerous territory. I'm looking at Jeannie, but I just mean as the structure that you kind of organize the project around.
So Alberto Giacometti, they both are students at Bordeaux. They both studied at this academy in Paris. So she makes the sculpture that we have seen now in this photograph of him, a portrait of him. He makes a portrait of her. Her portrait is actually this, which we have seen in the slideshow, this very flat, kind of almost like a slice of bread sculpture that it's pressed. It's really the moment where Alberto Giacometti moves back into an abstract period. It's a very short period. And so what's amazing about the sculpture is how two-sided it is. And so there's all this duality that in the piece existed. I think in the whole thinking when we started, it's like there was always this front side, back side. So the sculptures there was two sculptures. They made portraits of each other. It was always about this duality. And then when we found David, it was a long time David didn't exist. We researched and we developed a piece. And then when we found David, it became very clear for us what the structure was of how to create, the narrative, like in the film installation.
I mean, story is such a mushy word. We wanted to create a structure that was not consumable all at once. We wanted that they are two sides of a vastly different experience. What is seen and what is seen in relation to what is heard. That these two sides are forced to share a common soundtrack, which was a lot more challenging than it sounds. We wanted it to be in the round, and we wanted that as a viewer, you walk from one side of an experience with image and memory, which are always tethered to the sound that you see with that image, and then you walk to the other side, and that sound has a different utterance because it's impressed in your memory with very different imagery from a completely different time, from a completely different perspective on the other side. So we wanted it to be this kind of mechanism that was a model for a relationship. So a relationship between a mother and her son, yet they didn't talk about a lot of things as with most of us. And when it's too late to talk to the parent who's not there anymore, or the child, there's this distance. So we wanted, within the very thin space between those screens, to be kind of really a charged space of things that they were saying. What we hear Flora saying were excerpts from notes and diaries that she left behind. It's a conversation that they never had. It's also what we thought was sort of compelling or just bizarre is that although David's the son, he's now the old man, and although Flora's the mum, in the film she's a young woman. And so there would be these moments where we were talking about the piece internally, and we always get confused. We would get it confused ourselves.
Father's talking to his daughter.
And so it really, like who's that she's the daughter and he's the father, and it was just, so we wanted that there was this toggle of the two sides, and that the structure was literally something that for a viewer, you could only experience one side at a time.
I think you touch on one thing that I'd like to pull out, which is this kind of, it's not just a back and forth, it's like this zone in between kind of documentary filmmaking, or let's just say like fact-based, evidence-based storytelling, and kind of, fiction and narrative, and invented, the soundtrack for the film is, you've pieced together and you are, creating an environment, and you're creating the story that you want us to experience, in the sense of, you have centered Flora. You've taken her from the margins and you've made her center, but it's through your efforts that you have like sewn together these different parts of her life that you then share with us. So can you talk a little bit about how you walk in that in-between zone between kind of adhering to the evidence that is your source material and the kind of, I don't want to say fictive because it's not that it's made up, but the imagined kind of scenarios that you guys also summon in your work?
So it's based on facts, but it's a reconstruction or it's a reimagination.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it really, our attempt was never to tell another truth,
Mm-hmm.
because James Lord presented to us a truth, and we very quickly understood that history has to be rewritten constantly in order to kind of, every generation has to rewrite it and re-examine what's been written, who has written it, how was it written. And so it was, I think, clear from the beginning, it's not our attempt to correct history. So that's to suggest that this is the true Flora,
Mm-hmm.
this is the true Flora Mayor. I think it was much more an attempt to create an experience of a relationship between a son and a mother. I think that was far more important, and sort of that these surfaces kind of could relate to your own personal experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, they act as platforms or something. As a
Well,
train.
you also have this archive room which lays out all of this material, and I always like to tell people when I take them through, like, this is called an archive room, but there's still so many dots that we can't connect, even if we have all of this evidence. And that's really also part of, I would imagine, the intention with the film as well, that, we do have, it's not necessarily about correcting the historical record as putting forward an alternative kind of chapter on it.
Yeah, I mean, the archives, just to add to the archive, so this is the first time we show the archive. This is sort of
Thank you.
Nora, in the discussion about what we want to do in this iteration of this, showing this piece, we decided that we would like to show as much of the archive or some of the material that David shared with us and some of the material that we have collected over the past almost 3 years to try to create sort of another aspects, and especially for Denver, it was important to us, so we also work with the historical...
Yeah, the Denver Library and the Historical Society.
History Colorado, yeah.
And just to collect more information, because it made a lot of sense to do this in Denver, and so we had the opportunity to actually come here several times and continue. So this is an ongoing work. We see this... we have shown a small iteration at the Paris, Alberto Giacometti Foundation in Paris, and a much larger now iteration of this here in Denver. And I think there's an overwhelming amount of information. So, and I mean, it's fascinating for me to see how an audience responds to that.
Flora has traveled now to so many different locations around the world. Obviously, it premiered in Venice. It's been to Japan, France, Switzerland, Los Angeles, now Denver. It's going to Fort Worth in the spring, possibly other venues beyond that. Can you talk about the experience of seeing it live in the world in all these different ways, which I imagine it does in each different installation? And then, how do the sites of the exhibition, the locations, kind of alter or perhaps reframe the work, if at all? And now, kind of, I'll ask my follow-up question after that one.
Well, I think because I think about site a lot, it means, well, a lot to me at least, that, so for example, in this location, we're within walking distance of where Flora's family made and lost all of their money. And in the same token, when we showed the work at LACMA in Los Angeles, she lived within walking distance of that museum at the Versailles, right down the road. And according to her son, when in the final years of her life, she would go to that museum. And so it just meant a lot to kind of bring it to those sites again, or back to, and I mean, as an artist, when and I think most artists feel this way, that when we bring work to an audience, you have a lot of hopes. I think artists fundamentally are hopeful, otherwise why bother? Because it's so difficult. And you have hopes, but I think that we were genuinely touched at how the work was engaging people. And I think, I don't know, you guys, if you enjoyed the work, you can tell us, but I think maybe it has to do with, in some way, shape, or form, all of us have been a son or daughter, and all of us have a family of some kind, no matter how dysfunctional or functional it is. Yeah, and it's, in Japan, where I was in November, even with Japanese subtitles, I could just tell it was really affecting the audiences over there, and it's and we've what's been a delightful part of this project, and some of you might know this, is that David Mayo, the son, he was actually here in Denver, that after making this project, and he's not someone who's traveled a lot, when we brought him to Venice to first show him the piece when it was finished, and we brought him there before the crowds were there, and just so that he and his wife could experience the work finished alone, because we knew, he's a rather shy person, and to see him projected, see himself, we knew it would be kind of overwhelming, and so they stayed for hours, and then the crowds in Venice came, and they sat, and we got them tea out in the courtyard, and people would go up and hug him, strangers, and thank him, and it meant a lot. And so he's gone to Venice.
Celebrity.
He went to Japan, and he said people were bowing, and so he's been now to Denver. I think it's been really an important sort of phase for him of closure, but also opening.
I should add. It was shown actually in Germany, because Germany at the Museum Sammelngötz, which is a big supporter of this project, so not to forget them. And it was not shown in Switzerland yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was.
But it was in Venice, so in the Swiss Pavilion. Should just correct that.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit, maybe kind of taking a step back from this particular project, and think about how Flora, in some ways, or in a lot of ways, how it relates to other works and projects that you guys have been, that you have produced over the last, is it nearly 30 years that you guys have been working together? I won't say collaborating, because you're a single entity. Yeah. But some early work, for example, explored the mythology of the Western U.S., and here we are in the Mountains West region. Do you see Flora kind of related to that exploration? Do you see it as completely removed or distinct from those projects? How do you kind of, if at all, kind of connect any dots between your earlier work and this project?
So before we made Flora, we made this trilogy in which basically there were all locations in Texas. And that took us about, we usually work on a project, it can take us sometimes 3 years.
3 years for one.
So it took us probably 7 years to make that trilogy. And so these were really kind of the moment where we started working more and more with this, with interviews, like we kind of had what we would describe a near-documentary kind of style, maybe. Style, I don't like that word.
Approach.
We started we called them research-based works, where we go to a location we do not know from the onset what the final product will be, and we just start spending time on location. And that was quite similar with Flora.
It's really similar.
We started in one place.
We have some kind of trigger, and we want that the work takes us on a journey where we learn new things. We along the way we go to places that we're unfamiliar with. It's a chance for us. Like there's a kind of cliche thing about photography that you let the camera take you places, and in a way that was true. So, for example, one of the works in the trilogy was called Movie Mountain Méliès, and we were on a road trip, and a rancher who was showing us around said, "Oh yeah, over there's Movie Mountain," and come to find out when we researched it, there's only one mountain in the world called Movie Mountain. And it's a pretty non-spectacular hump in the middle of this the Chihuahuan Desert, and come to find out through research that actually Gaston Méliès, who was the lesser known, far less famous brother of Georges Méliès, who made Voyage to the Moon. All of you have probably seen that silent picture film where it's like a beer can kind of goes into the side of the moon that's a face. Fantastic, great filmmaker. Well, his brother was kicking around that region making B-Westerns. It's a long story, but the research that led us to link that it was Gaston Méliès who stopped by this non-spectacular hump and made a B-Western that got the ranchers calling it Movie Mountain. And so that film and that trilogy is about exploring that region. And so all of that led us to the path of Flora. In the trilogy, one work is one channel, the second work is dual channels, and we started with a push and pull of those both screens next to each other, and Giant, which is the last one, is three screens. So we started to really push and pull against the screen more, and so Flora is just a step
further
in that, yeah.
Or just another step.
Yeah.
Do you see Flora as a part of a series? Like, is it the beginning of another series? No.
I hope not.
What was the allure for you? What was the allure of working in series with that the trilogy, and why is Flora not necessarily going to be a part of one?
I think it's so. I find it is a culmination of the trilogy before we got all the failures or the mistakes or the challenges. We kind of wouldn't say learned, but we incorporated them in Flora. So I think we're ready to do another piece and not start another trilogy. But when we started the first part of the trilogy, Grand Paris, Texas, we didn't know that we would make a trilogy. Okay. So that's why I say I hope not.
So you never
know. I hope not. I just want to add one thing that we haven't talked about yet, but it was so important in terms of when we when we make our works, we really think about building, and so integral to the process of building this film experience was the process of building bust. So this sculpture made by Flora Mayo, it's lost. It was destroyed, and so part of us, when we were studying this poor quality photograph, we wanted to build out from that photograph, rebuild that lost sculpture, which we don't even know if it was finished or not. And that process of
why was
building,
it so important to rebuild that sculpture for you?
It just was. I mean, both of us come from a background of making, of touching, and so it was this process of going from a flat surface, which is the flat surface of the photograph, building space, making stuff up, following a kind of path, which was this blurry photograph, yet inventing. It just was really important process for us. And then also because what I love about a part of what we do is like it's a lot of effort, but at the end it's just light and sound, and then poof, it's gone. It's like nothing. It's totally not. It's there, but it's not there. And so this process of then casting, of modeling, and then casting it in brass. It's so solid and will last. Given that it was lost, it just seemed important that it had a thingness.
Give it permanence almost.
Yeah. And of course, those of you that are in the audience that work with filmmaking or photography, like I love the analogy between when you cast an object and you've got a negative and you make a positive. All that's so like what happens, on a sheet of negatives. It's so analogous.
I think it was also the process. So we started with the sculpture before we knew anything about the rest of this story, or we didn't know about David when we started that sculpture.
Oh, wow.
I think it was a lot about thinking about likeness. So the biggest, or one of the challenges was Flora's sculpture, which we only had one view, to trying to recreate the likeness of Alberto Giacometti, and when he was 25, and at the same time to be true to Flora's rendering of Alberto Giacometti, which are two very different things. And so it was very, very challenging to, and I think it was a constant, that experience of trying to reconstruct likeness out of a flat surface, I think is very inspirational for us then to reconstruct sort of a narrative between fact and fiction, or fact and recreation. So that's kind of, I think that inspired us to go that route.
That's wonderful. Well, it also speaks to how you then take all of this documentation, all of this material that is three-dimensional, and you kind of create, again, to your point, sound and light in the film, and you kind of make it flat again, that kind of back and forth between as an act of, or a gesture of reconstruction, or reimagining, as you said earlier, that materializes in both the kind of predictable way and also in an unpredictable way. I want to just maybe talk about one other question before we turn it over to the audience, which is how I think many of your works, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit in terms of the origins of Flora's, this project of on Flora Mayo, but how many of your earlier works as well also feature these strong female protagonists or subjects of your projects. Can you share with us kind of why that is such an important, I'm presuming it is such an important and conscious choice and decision on your part, but how those ideas were formed for yourselves?
Well, I'm a woman, and I think there's this whole thing, that's been written a lot about the history of women in film. This history of being looked atness, and so I'm drawn to female protagonists who are in a moment of on the way to get to somewhere. They are, as Gordon Matta Clark, the artist Gordon Matta Clark, used to talk about architecting, and I love the idea that these protagonists, these female protagonists, are architecting their way through an experience, through a situation that they're in complex ways, and they push back against both the surface of the screen and the gaze of being looked atness. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, in a pragmatic way, I'm quite comfortable working with women, which sounds so strange because I work with you. But yeah, there's just something that comes from my experience that I'm just more, mm-hmm. I'm more interested in her.
This, yes.
Yeah.
Before I ask you the question, I just wanted to say thank you for the journey. Good journey. and I wanted to drag us just in the direction of the relationship that each artist has with their art. And it was a very poignant story from that point of view. Female protagonist in this case. Would you talk about whether there was any conscious view of that? Do you think that was just incidental in what it is you ended up creating? That would be, the contrast between the male and the female artists in this case is a good. Thanks.
Well, this particular story, we don't like to make that analogy because people would mistake our intention, but they met. So Flora meets Alberta in art school, basically. And we met each other in an artist residency. So there's a lot of parallels, not in terms of where we come from and where we end up to, but I think that when we started working together, we actually were always in the work. We used each other as kind of prototypes of a woman and of a man. That's how we started to work. So I think it's a very natural process to think about this duality. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. Is he understanding your question? I'm not sure I understood it.
Am I being clear? I think the only question is that duality that you mentioned.
Yes.
Is sort of implied in a lot of the way that the story unfolds.
Yes.
And that's really sociologically what I was sort of asking you to talk about. During that time especially, and I'll just say it this way, there's a stereotype associated with strong male artisans and their creation and their creative energy, and that's only on a continuum, but it's, if you look at the whole of humanity, that's very much rare, and here is Nora nonetheless creating no matter what. Just an interesting dichotomy to recognize.
Yeah, I mean, I can add, so one of the things besides the trigger of Lord's text when I first saw the photograph, in the moment that that photograph was taken, somewhere around 1927, in that moment, both Flora Mayo and Alberto Giacometti, they're students. Both are full of potential. And we know from history very well what happens to one of them, and it's kind of this push and pull. He goes into the books, and she not only doesn't, she then even in 2005 gets literally pulled from the back of the rack, and that really struck me in the moment that in Giacometti's life, you know, he came from a family of artists. So he was born into the world anointed with being talented from a very young age, and being surrounded by family and godfathers, a whole community who were supporting him, giving him confidence, and letting him know not only could he do it, he should do it. Very different from Mayo, who, although was brought up in great privilege, it was a highly unsupportive and repressive kind of environment, and it just struck me that within that flat surface of that one photograph, there was just so much different kinds of layers and textures, and yeah, I'm not sure if that addresses your question. It was important for us. We went through a lot of different scenarios, including should Flora destroy her work, because wow, that'd be pretty spectacular. But we decided we wanted her in the world of her studio, in the mode of creating, of making, rather than
of what she was supposedly known for,
Right.
of the destruction of
Yeah.
her work.
Right. It's giving her agency in yet another way. You know, that you show her in the acts of creation rather than acts of destruction. And since there is so little, if anything, but the one sculpture that we have upstairs that remains of her work, you give her, it's in part how you give her a voice again, because you endow her with what she, I don't want to say what she should be known for, but at least you allow her to be known for that thing.
yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I should add, so the piece is called Flora. That's also how we discuss, the whole bust is part of Flora, the archive is part of Flora, but it's not Flora Mayo. So it's very important for us that it goes beyond Flora Mayo, and so I think she becomes a surrogate for many women in this, maybe in this time, in this situation.
Yeah, it's really not important for us whether, and I'm completely uninterested in the question of whether she was a good artist or not. I'm interested in the questions about all of the mechanisms at play in one's life that even lead to someone being able to take a path of becoming an artist. That's what the project is much more concerned about. It's irrelevant to me if she was not an undiscovered artist, not that her work, it's not important for me if the work was good or not. That's not the questions that I'm interested in asking with this work.
Sure, it's what were the institutions and the systems that were in place that prevented her, obstructed her path, but yet made his path, to your point, much more wide and open.
Yeah.
I would love for you to talk about how you work together. I understand we don't use the word collaborate.
So we have been doing this for a long time. I mean, there's a lot of these are background images of the process. We have most often changing roles. So we really jump in, like we sometimes end the sentence or fill in a sentence, and that's how we work. When we film, we change automatically. When we take photographs, we switch their role. It's very fluid. And I think the one difference between in our process is that I mostly think by drawing, and Teresa thinks by writing. That's probably the one moment that's also the moment where we do not spend time together. And we do a lot of walking. Like we were the most, it's the most generative when we can walk together, talking about our work.
Yeah, so we try to walk every day. They're working walks. And that's probably one of the most generative, freeing times, because we work a lot on computers. We spend a lot of time just sitting. And so to be able to be out in the world and that's if we have a daily practice, that's how I would describe it. We walk and we talk, and we know we're on a great, interesting path or journey when it's not my idea with sort of snippets of his input in. It's really becoming this third idea, this third voice that is not mine, it's not his, it's this third thing that we never would have come to without the collaboration. And I probably make it sound a lot more smooth than what it really is. We walk and then it all comes together. But no, I all of the challenges are worth it. Otherwise, we wouldn't continue, would we? Hi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a really moving work.
Thank you.
My work is with history exhibitions, and so my filter for walking through those spaces upstairs was influenced by that, and I could see a lot of things in those spaces that would not have surprised me in a history exhibition. But I know that the filters that you come to these stories with are different than an historian's, and I can hear that in some of the way you've described the work. But I wonder if it's possible for you to say a little more about what an artist's concerns and preoccupations and experiences might result in this work that would be different from the way an historian would approach it.
I think we allow for far more emotion. As an historian, I think we're not detached as And I think, especially in this piece, we always thought it was very a moving story, but then we were really surprised how our personal feelings translated to an audience. And I think if we would think as historians, we would not allow for that kind of contemplation. I think.
And I think that we just don't, we have a real uneasy relationship to the authority of history that I think led us to ask questions that hadn't been asked before. And we firmly believe, because that's the trajectory of our work, that it's all about looking and questioning what you're looking, finding and not finding. I remember, for example, when we first met with David and we were going through some of the things in his trunk, and we found a lot of materials, and he didn't know. He didn't have any idea what he had. He'd only kept those things because they were his mother's. He didn't know about Giacometti and didn't care. He was not in the art world at all. But I remember when we came across the photographs of her with him, we were trying to verify, but we were pretty sure. And we took some shots with our iPhone and sent them to some of the experts in Europe. But of course, we didn't just blindly send them. First, I made some calls and was literally told, all of the photographs of Alberto Giacometti have been found, and I said, well, maybe, but could you please? I'll send you an email and please, with some attachments. Please just take a look. And then the phone started ringing, and that was just not making assumptions, because always assumptions have some sort of bias, and we have assumptions that we bring to the project ourselves. When we're I wouldn't say we're necessarily better. Our bias is just different. I'm going to fight for her, and I think that I remember when we were working on the trilogy, and we brought in some of the ranchers and some of the locals whose ancestors had performed in the Gaston Mellier's Bee Western. And I think it's one of the greatest compliments someone's ever made about what we do. He said, well, you sure made a lot of something out of nothing. Isn't that great? I thought...
What brought you to the University of Texas?
Well, we run...
It's a long story.
Long story, I'll make
short.
it short. We run the photography and media area in the Department of Art and Art History. And that's what brought us to Austin, Texas. The slightly longer story is that I used to be in a band called Bridge Troll. And when we did our mini tour, we had stopped in Austin, Texas, and so I had remembered the city for many years before. And yeah, so that's, we teach and live. It's a nice community there. We like it a lot.
You're going to have an uptick in downloads tonight, I'm sure. Teresa and Alex, thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.